Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome to this joint ICCT and Egmont Institute live briefing on gender and far-right ideology with two brilliant speakers with me today. This is already the third joint event organized by ICCT and the Egmont Institute. Being aware that the first joint briefing was organized on the expansion of jihadi terrorism in Africa, and the second joint event was organized on white supremacism in the United States of America and Western Europe. So it's quite an interesting and successful series of events that we have been hosting together. The Egmont Institute, which is the Royal Institute for International Relations, which is a think tank based in Brussels, Belgium, and ICCT, the International Center for Counter-Terrorism, which is a think and do tank based in The Hague, Netherlands. And I have the joy and privilege to be double-hatted as the director of ICCT and a senior associate fellow with the Egmont Institute. Today, we will, and in a second, I will introduce you with our two brilliant speakers. Maybe just a few housekeeping notes before we start this session. This session will last an hour 15 up to an hour 30. And basically, we will start by a discussion between myself and the speakers, and that will be followed by a Q&A session. You can ask all of your questions in the Q&A little feature that you can see normally at the bottom of your screen. Please use the Q&A box and not the chat, because that's the one that I will be monitoring, and you can ask as many questions as you want. Try to be as precise and specific, because I need to understand your question to be able to properly ask it to the speakers. Please also note that we are recording this briefing and we will make it available on our ICCT's YouTube channel after the end of this event. And also a little bit of a heads up that at the end of this event, when you close the session, you will see a little post-event survey that will pop up on your screen. Please take the time, literally a few seconds, to answer the questions. It's quite important for us to evaluate our events so that we can take your comments into account to improve all future events. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce the two speakers that are with us today. So on the one hand, we have with us Dr. Evian Leidig, who is a Marie Skłodowska-Curie postdoctoral fellow at Tilburg University here in the Netherlands, and who is also an associate fellow at ICCT and an affiliate with CIREX, the Center for Research on Extremism at the University of Oslo, and also affiliated with GNET, the Global Network on Extremism and Technology at King's College London. And she will talk notably on the basis of her most recent book on the woman of the far right, social media influencers and online radicalization, which was just recently published by Columbia University Press last September. And I'm sure there must be some advertisement, or it's quite easy to find the book. We also have with us Dr. Elizabeth Pearson, who is a lecturer in criminology at Royal Holloway University of London in the UK, where she leads the master's program in terrorism and counterterrorism studies. And her book, Extreme Britain, Gender, Masculinity and Radicalization, is out with Hurst and Oxford University Press next month. She's also an associate fellow with ICCT and previously worked at the BBC. Again, also, I'm sure, easy to find the book online or in the best bookstores, maybe even with a discount, perhaps. So without further ado, maybe I want to ask both of our speakers What is it? Because you both wrote these two brilliant books that just came out, but what made you want to work on this topic? What sort of triggered your interest specifically for writing those books? Maybe Evian, if I can start with you.
Sure. Thanks very much, Thomas, and also for that kind introduction into ICCT and Egmont Institute for hosting today's live briefing. So I have been studying the far right for several years, but what really motivated me to want to write this book were three notable reasons. So the first was, despite a lot of scholarly and particularly media attention being devoted to the far right, there tended to be this stereotype about what the far right looked like, which is primarily angry young men, not always so young, but angry men, we could say. And so I knew that there was women who played quite prominent roles within the far right. They just weren't being featured so prominently within both policy and academic discussions. So I wanted to showcase what was the nature of their involvement in this movement. The second aspect, which I picked up on, which was that these women, they would do quite similar activities to their male counterparts when it came to things like political commentary, or sort of offering reflections on current political events. But what struck my interest in the women was how they would tend to present themselves in a very holistic way. So, yes, they were offering political commentary, but they were also posting on Instagram about making dinner for their families or gardening. And so I was really curious as to why these women would purposely try to showcase themselves in this manner beyond just the politics side. And then finally, in the last point in terms of what motivated me to write this book was that the last academic book that I had read about women in the far right was Kathleen Blease from 2002. So it had been about 20 years since I'd actually seen an academic book featuring women within far right movements. So I just thought there needed to be an update for today. So that's why I wanted to focus on women within the contemporary far right.
Thanks, Evian. Elizabeth, turning to you with literally the same question.
Well, there were a number of reasons similar to Evian. I think the book is actually about, it's not just about the far right. So it's about two movements. It's about the radical right, so very specifically street actors, really in anti-Islam street movements that were active and in fact seem resurgent, but they were active when I was doing my research from 2016 to 2018. And also Anjem Choudhury and some of his actors. So some of those had been involved with Al Muhajirun. It's a band group, but the same people were active under different names. And then people that were kind of on the network, in the scene, online, or kind of hangers-on, people like that. And when I originally started the work for this, which was a PhD project, I was interested in reciprocal radicalization, cumulative extremism, which was kind of a hot topic at the time. And that was what took me out there talking to people. And that was another motivation, was that I used to work, you mentioned I used to work in BBC Radio. I was always talking to people. And I thought, can I talk to them? What will they tell me about why they got involved in this? And then I wanted to use gender because I felt like that was really absent from thinking about how radicalization happens. And that where it had been used, it was often sidelined. It was about women. Women are really, really important because they've been invisible in this for a long time, as Evian said. But I wanted to use a gender analysis that looked at both men's and women's engagement in these movements and adopted a gender lens, subjected those to a gender analysis. So that's why the book is, sort of subtitled Masculinity and Radicalization, because in the event, it was much easier to talk to men than to women. And masculinities became a really important part of how I was, of what was going on, basically, in terms of what people were telling me about their engagement in the movement for both men and for women as well, actually. So those were my motivations.
Thanks for that. And I mean, for potentially the people in the audience who might not necessarily know like you know, what are we talking about here? Like, how big is the phenomenon of women in the far right? Like, is it something like that is of an equal proportion with men, or is it something that is still smaller? Or to put it differently, is extremism and terrorism something else than just a man's problem, as it's been often assumed in this field? Evian, perhaps you want to go?
So correct me if I'm wrong, Liz, but I think you would probably agree with me that the far right is male dominated. And certainly we do see women who may or may not be as visible. And I think it can kind of depend at what spectrum of the far right you're looking at, whether that is something like a political party where we have seen a lot more women leaders come to the forefront, or if we're looking at, say, a social movement, or other types of groups and organizations, maybe those that are focused on things like combats, we might not see women so present. So I think in regards to your question, it does sort of depend on what aspect of the far right that we're looking at. Now, for my research, I was primarily focused upon a very specific spectrum of the far right, those who are primarily engaged in what is called metapolitical activism. So these are people who are not so focused on short-term gains at the ballot box, but people who are more concerned with trying to shape social and cultural norms within mainstream society. So they engage in a lot of more high-level intellectual discussions, other types of social and cultural commentary, because their aim is ultimately to shape public consciousness towards their views. But this is, I think, a very specific strand of the far right landscape. And within that specific strand, I do see women much more present within these circles, because the groups and organizations who do occupy this space actually tend to recruit university students, and also very well educated, very articulate young people, and including women, who they tend to then platform as spokespersons to essentially normalize and legitimize a lot of their extreme ideas for mainstream appeal and to mainstream audiences. But I think this is quite a different phenomenon than I think Liz has touched upon in her work. Liz, I think from what I understand, you do more like the grassroots activism side.
Yeah, so it's interesting, that question, how much of an issue are women? And also in the far right, the far right is a big term, right? It's a big umbrella term. Evian was looking at something really specific in her book, you talk in your book about this being a moment online where there's this celebrity cultures that these women tap into. And I was looking at something quite different again. I was looking at very specifically anti-Islam street movements. I think both of us talk in our books about where there are overlaps, and the fact that there are, they're not entirely distinct, but there's enough differences to kind of justify being a bit more precise with the terminology, and particularly for those who'd like to counter these groups. Absolutely. This is mainly, if you look out there, you look at the people on the street in the UK, for instance, it's mainly men. We see it. It's was maybe 70-30 at demonstrations I was going to, men to women. How much of an issue are the women? They are an issue, because we're talking about people, we're talking about holistic movements that have a vision for men and for women, for families, for gender relations, in which women are important as leaders, not just symbolically. And I think, I'm talking more about your work, Evian, but you have so many men looking at these women's kind of platforms. We've got men engaged in what women are doing. We've also got women, not just actively engaged in these movements, symbolically important as leaders, but symbolically important in the narratives, these ultra-nationalist narratives around what women should be doing, in the narratives around women being victimized by Muslim men, a very common narrative with the anti-Islam far right. And again, a narrative which we see persistently in nationalist groups, ultra-nationalist and otherwise. So, we can't discount the role of women either in the numbers or in terms of symbolically how they're being used in the narratives, or in their symbolic power as leaders, in the direction that they're pushing those movements to go. So they're really important. They're as important in these groups as they are in society. They can't be discounted because they're not necessarily visible on the streets, when you do a head count of who is there.
No, and that's a very important point, absolutely, Liz. But you also touch on the role that they play. So may I push you on that a little bit and ask you, what is exactly the role that these women are playing, or to put a sort of a bit of a stereotypical question in terrorism studies, like what is the typical profile of these women, and what role do they play in those movements?
Well, I don't know that I can give you a typical profile, even for this sort of small subsection of the far right that I was looking at. And remember, I didn't talk to many women for my study. I talked to 17 people in depth, in total, of which it was hard to access the women. So, and I was interested in, I said to everyone, I'm interested in gender, and they obviously thought that means women, but I was interested in how gender was kind of producing these extreme identities, how they were formed, and masculinities obviously came into it for both of them. And I'll give you an example of how it's difficult to say sort of anything about the profile. I was talking to two really key leaders, Jada Franson, who was the deputy leader of Britain First at the time I was doing this work, and Anne-Marie Waters, who was the leader of For Britain. And she'd also been active in trying to get Pegida, German anti-Islam group, up and running in the UK with Tommy Robinson. They come at this they're not friends, they come at this from completely different kind of perspectives. Anne-Marie Waters, a gay woman who is essentially mobilizing for gay rights, and obviously regards Islam as something which is a threat to gay rights. She was a socialist involved with the Labour Party. She was very much a patriot feminist. They don't like feminists, but she was willing to call herself a patriot feminist. Jada Franson, I've been to demonstrations and also events like an AGM and a Christmas do for Britain First, where she's against women's rights, she's against abortion, she's coming at this from a Christian perspective. There's no love lost between them. These are completely different approaches, but these are two women leaders ostensibly in the same sub-scene of the far right. And those kind of divisions and differences in ideological stance are found when you talk to the diverse women in these scenes, who also coming from different kinds of backgrounds. I guess the one thing I could say about these women was that they were mobilizing around a very working class kind of identity, which, that's their claim. It's not my claim about them. I wouldn't take that at face value. And that's quite different from what we've seen online, perhaps with, the influencers that have a much more sanitized, curated vision of themselves that they're putting out there, that Avianne is dealing with. So these were women that regarded themselves as second-class citizens, but who were mobilizing around this loss of rights for working-class Britons. And that's the narrative that they would kind of get around. And of course, they would unite around certain issues as well. They can all come together when they need to in the face of other threats. But there was an awful lot of fragmentation and differentiation in terms of gender even in the sort of small set of people that I was looking at in a UK context.
Thanks for that, Liz. And indeed, very important to clarify that gender is not only about looking at women, it's about looking at gender in all of its aspects. Evian, maybe, obviously you also have been looking at the role and profile of this group of women that you've been focusing on in your research. You may want to tell us something about that, perhaps.
Yeah, and I also appreciate that Liz highlighted internal divisions that are there that often get glossed over in her research, at least. At least when it comes to the influencers that I had studied for the book, they had very similar backgrounds. That was quite striking to me. So they all describe themselves as having grown up in middle-class families, in middle-class neighborhoods. Almost all the women I studied went to university, and some even pursued master's degrees. And they also described then, after graduating from university, sort of entering the corporate profession, right? So talking about climbing that social ladder. And they also discussed, living in urban areas and frequently socializing with friends and colleagues. So I think this in itself already debunks stereotypes that we might have about far-right actors in terms of their backgrounds, their class, their education levels, etc. And again, this might be specific to the spectrum of the far right that I was looking at, but I still think that is quite important in terms of understanding just how multifaceted this landscape can be. But I think an aspect that was quite striking to me was how these influencers were particularly adept at using certain gendered narratives that they would tailor towards both their male and their female audiences. So by that, I mean that these far-right women influencers, they will produce content talking about social issues like how mainstream society is anti-men, for example. And these are actually some of the most popular videos that I had noticed on their channels, where they promote certain notions of masculinities that Liz has written about in her work, around traits like aggression, dominance, and leadership. And these far-right women influencers will speak to their male viewers saying, you can exercise these traits within far-right movements, and ideally find a traditional submissive wife within the movement as well. But then the content that these far-right women influencers will tailor towards their female viewers will be on aspects like sisterhood, like finding a community of friendship for women within the far-right. And so when I started off writing this book, I had really assumed that it was just far-right women that would be radicalizing other women into the far-right. But I very quickly had noticed that, it kind of depends on the platform, but at least on YouTube, for example, they had far more male viewers than female viewers. Whereas on a platform like Instagram, they had a lot more female viewers, and we can kind of dig into why those differences emerged. But when we're talking about the role of gender in radicalization amongst the far right, we also should not position ourselves into these, into thinking that it's only women that radicalize other women and men that radicalize other men. Oftentimes we can see that it's quite an interchangeable process, because while these influencers have a lot of male viewers, these same influencers had all cited that their source of inspiration were male activists within the scene, right? So we should think about also then how interchangeable these conduits of influence can be.
Thanks, Vivian. I mean, can I just, also for the interest of our audience who might not yet have read your book, but I'm sure will, can you tell us a little bit more about these different channels that you've been looking at, telling us a little bit, what these channels are, what they're talking about on these channels, and also how broad the audience is?
So at a basic level, I selected a group of far-right women who are most primarily known by their online presence. And some are connected to offline groups like the Identitarian movement in Europe, or what was Identity Europa in the US before it became the American Resistance Movement. But despite some of these offline connections to organizations, most of these women actually came to be known through their online presence, and primarily through their early roles as political actors on YouTube. So they were offering a lot of commentary and hot takes on current events. So I focus on about a dozen key women, mostly within the US and Canada, but then I also look at some of the transnational connections to other influencers within the Netherlands, France, and Germany, for example, and then the transnational connections therein. The primary platforms that I do focus on in the book are YouTube and Instagram. And the reason for that is because these are highly visual platforms, and they're also extremely mainstream ones. And that is actually quite a central argument of the book, which is that these far-right women influencers are exploiting the publicness of mainstream platforms like YouTube and Instagram in order to reach mainstream audiences. And I show throughout the book how they tend to normalize and legitimize a lot of extreme right ideas and make that palatable to their audiences because they convey those messages through things like health and wellness content or just food vlogging or sort of gardening with their kids. They try to showcase a lot of that lifestyle content, and they'll use coded language of extreme ideas to make that quite palatable and relatable to broad audiences.
Thanks, Evian. And I already take note that we already have some questions in the Q&A tab. Interesting questions. I will definitely relay those a little bit later in the conversation. But Liz, turning to you, I mean, Evian already touched quite on a number of points that link to the role and importance of gender in the process of radicalization, so notably radicalization online. Could you also tell us from your point of view and from your research, what exactly did you see with regard to the role of gender in radicalization and propaganda?
Sure. So, I mean, I wasn't looking at the propaganda so much when I was doing this project, right? So this was a project that was primarily about talking to people. So, and I was sort of asking them to tell me how they got involved. I wasn't asking them, I wasn't asking Tommy Robinson, where does your money come from, or questions like that, because I'm not going to get a truthful answer in all likelihood. And people would talk to me about themselves, about their lives, about how they got involved in these groups. And so for this section of the far right, what we're talking about are people who are entirely really mobilized by local issues, by local changes in their areas. And I characterize radicalization as a masculinity project in the book, because what comes out of the stories that people tell me are the ways in which they are fulfilling particular expressions of masculinity, particular identities, masculine identities, in order to become these extreme actors who are active for the English Defence League or for Britain First or for Britain, or moving between these groups and moving around this kind of circuit. So one of the things that, when we are sort of looking at thinking about what extremism is, if you look at like Berger's definition about, your survival being predicated upon the domination of another group, the non-survival of another group, this in-group versus out-group. The ways in which people were distinguishing between their in-group and an out-group were through gender, and particularly through sexual norms. And it really sounds like an obvious thing to say, but changes that were gender-related within people's local areas, often relating to women's dress, as is familiar from, the literature. So around migrants with Muslim heritage wearing different clothing. These were the things that were making people distinguish in-group from out-group, and providing those kind of that very first beginning of difference and mobilization against. Masculinities were really important because pretty much everybody that spoke to me about how they started talked to me about the role of violence, casual violence, in their radicalization towards the radical right. So violence as a mobilizing factor. The violence was a hobby, really, I would characterize it as, for most of the men that were talking to me. They didn't have the same relationship with violence as I did. To me, it's something extraordinary, abnormal. It's not part of my repertoire. For them, it's a way of establishing themselves, establishing their status. And they were growing up, they described, in these kind of low-level violent communities. The violence is not coming from Muslim others, it's coming from men like them, right? And that physicality and that expression of physicality is really, really important in producing the behaviors that then, criminal behaviors that become mobilized for the extreme group, where this kind of idea of redemption that we see in other narratives, other work, in jihadist groups as well, becomes really important, that this violence becomes mobilized for a good. So this was kind of the key way in which gender was kind of evident in this distinction between who my set of actors is and who the other set of actors is, through gender and sexual norms just in everyday life, and through the importance of casual violence and inhabiting your body as somebody that can project that ability to be to be somebody who can succeed in violence, essentially. And that's not the only thing that was going on, but it was a really important thing that was going on. And that idea of confrontation and success in confrontation was also something that women reflected, particularly in humiliating Muslim men in confrontation, whether that was offline and sort of if men were doing street dawah in their area, in, getting involved in heckling them, shouting them down, embarrassing them because they're just a woman. That was their perception of it. Or online in spats with other people. Through challenging people, they would, and coming out dominant, that would prove your status. And that was really important for women as well. It's a really important feature of, all of these people were active online, but for them, it was very much about proving yourself offline as well. It was like online was important, but it was the offline space where people could really, demonstrate this authenticity that was crucial to somebody like Tommy Robinson's appeal to both men and women, that they represent something genuine, not something fake, like people in universities or people who work in the BBC. They're just fake. They're just saying what people want to hear. They were authentic and real. And part of that was very much to do with this proximity to violence.
And yeah, I mean, it's fascinating, and I largely agree with you. But then, what I find somehow puzzling, but I mean, I can imagine the explanation. But in what you're explaining, Liz, and you, Evian, it's like it's as if we had two parallel worlds, right? I mean, you have the world of masculinity, and that is like driving men to radicalize towards this movement, and then you have this world of like, how do you call that again, Evian, like all these, traditional life, and all this like with fashion and nutrition and all of this aspect of radicalization into the far right for some of the female audiences. Like, how can it work in parallel, and how can these two converge somewhere into one group or ideology? That's a bit of that's my question. Do these crowds mix somewhere, or do they live in a parallel world?
Yeah, that's a really tough question, because I mean, the far right is an extremely fragmented landscape. I think, as Liz and I are discussing with respect to the different sections that we've looked at, although one can argue that there are certain ideological overlaps that they do share in common. So even though Liz has focused primarily on the anti-Islam mobilization side, I mean, the same far-right influencers that I studied also are vehemently anti-Islam. They're also extremely anti-Semitic, they're xenophobic, they're racist. And so there are certainly ideological similarities, I think, that we see. And I think perhaps it does depend on the section of the far right you're looking at in terms of how dominant certain strains of that ideology are, and whether or not that actually features in people's commitments to various groups and organizations or to different networks. But that is, I would argue, to be something that is an overlap between these various sections of the far right. And then for perhaps the more specific aspect of the far right that I'm looking at, I mean, despite these differences in gender narratives between femininity and masculinity, I also started to see certain overlaps when it came to things that revolved around personal issues. So things like self-help was a very common topic of discussion for both men and for women, or a focus on the body in terms of the focus on fitness or health and wellness. And so these particular components of, one could argue, revolved around personal lifestyle, which then tended to be accompanied by ideological messaging and this aspect of, community building and identity fusion along that process. But yeah, with Liz, I'm not sure in your research if you would also see the same in terms of things like ideological overlap between what you've studied and what I have.
No, I think it's interesting that the word ideology, because for me, it was like when I started doing this work, it was about having a coherent belief system, a consistent set of values that would work together. And, when I was talking to people in the radical right, they didn't want to talk to me, obviously, to start with anyway. They thought I was going to stitch them up in some way. And, but I would try and talk about ideology, and they didn't, they're not, this was, yes, it's about, it's almost instinctive, right? Because it's about local issues. And these people were, and again, this is a difference between the types of people, perhaps, but like mostly the people that I was speaking to they were reading frantically all the time on Twitter. They were reading current affairs. They're not reading text. They weren't reading books. A couple were. So I had 2 Polish participants. They both, I don't know what they took from them, but they both read books. The grassroots leaders had a more developed kind of ideological system. They didn't like the word ideology. They're like, no, this is not about ideology. This is not about politics. It's not about being far right. It says EDL slogan, not far right, just right. And they would say, no, it's Islam that's the ideology. It's Islam that has the coherent set of beliefs. We're just responding to the bad things that are happening in our neighborhoods, which meant they were worried about being called racist, right? So they don't like this term ideological, because if you're ideological, it sounds like maybe you're a Nazi. It sounds like you could be much more easily called a racist. So they kind of reject this. But of course, they have an ideological repertoire, and whether they like it or not, the things they are doing and saying fit into a recognizable set of ideological values, which, is familiar to those who work on the far right. But, so they and you see it at the moment with the conflict, Israel, Gaza. So you've got people like Tommy Robinson, who are online fervently kind of tweeting pro-Israel tweets, whatever X does, that we say he's Xing all this pro-Israeli propaganda. And that is obviously anathema to the more traditional parts of the far right who are anti-Semitic. So there's a split there. When I was talking to Tommy Robinson, he would say, he would talk about Britain First, which is a much more explicitly racist, old school far right political party in the UK. And he would say, they would be calling for unity. Let's all get together across all these divisions in the far right. We'd be much stronger that way. Tommy Robinson would say, no, that never have unity with those people. They're racist. They don't like black people. And Tommy Robinson and Paul Golding now seem to have some kind of alliance going on. So there's a lot of pragmatism to these alliances and liaisons that are, and not necessarily strictly ideological, but there are, I hesitate to use the word strategic, because I don't think someone like Robinson looks ahead that much towards, the consequences necessarily of his actions, or at least he wasn't at the time that I was talking to him. There are a great deal of ideological tensions. And again, with the radical right, that tension is a gendered tension, because the far right historically regarded gay people as deviant. It was against homosexuality, because of the emphasis on reproduction, the furtherance of the white nation. Whereas the radical right, again, because distinguishing itself from Islam, which it understands to be homophobic, was all about, let's have gay rights, let's have Sikh rights, let's have a Sikh EDL branch, let's mobilize around this, not around trans rights. So there are these tensions between different parts of the far right, and they were pushing back on each other all the time. There's tensions for women leaders. They got a lot of abuse online for being women leaders, for being deviant, for not being in the kitchen at home, having the family. And this is like, there's a lot of tension, a lot of emotional labor in being a woman involved in the far right, because of these fractions and fragmentations and the difficulties of navigating what the far right used to be to what it's becoming, and those fragments between them. And I'll stop talking, because I think I've gone over the sort of 2 minutes. So
No, absolutely fine. Thanks for your answer, Liz. I'd like to maybe surface already a first question from the audience. A question from Lizzie Durden, journalist in the UK, who is asking if you, Evian, or Liz have seen a concept of good woman and bad woman within the far right movements. And basically, Lizzie explains that basically she has seen anecdotal evidence of basically far right claiming to protect the woman, but at the same time also sort of very destructively responding to women transgressing sort of the stereotypical image of the woman. Maybe starting with you, Evian, have you seen this this notion of good woman, bad woman in your research?
Yes, and I think Lizzie is quite correct here in pointing out that there's often this construction of, women being pure, innocent, naive, and in need of protection from men. Primarily, quote, our men, meaning men within the far right who align with those who align with them. And then similarly, if women are seen to transgress those traditional values, they're seen to be deviant, they're seen to be overtly sexualized. And so I would agree with that dual construction that is implied in Lizzie's question. But I would also say that even despite the far right women that I did study for this book, I mean, even those who were platformed for being the sort of the de facto leaders and spokespersons of the movements, yes, there was a lot of acceptance of their positions in terms of this idea that for a movement to succeed, you need to have women within it. And so these women would often justify their own positionings and saying, if we don't speak out, who will? And so there was certainly, I think, a more of a strategic or perhaps pragmatic reasoning behind platforming these far-right women influencers. But these same influencers would receive a lot of backlash. And I don't want to paint this glossy picture that they were universally accepted by everybody within the far right. So of course they would receive a lot of misogyny, a lot of sexism. If you just go to 4chan or to some other forums, you can see what's been written about these women saying, why don't you just go back to the kitchen barefoot? So these types of comments that would be made. And they would also be called trad thoughts, which was a concept meaning a woman who supposedly promotes traditional values online, but in reality doesn't live up to that. And so these women would often be called things like trad thoughts and have their faces plastered across the internet with these disparaging remarks. Now, and this is a tension that we see within the movement. And I think, Lizzie, you would agree with exactly this type of construction of what is considered to be good and bad womanhood within the far right.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a chapter in the book about women's leadership and misogyny. There's a lot of misogyny. These are essentially male-dominated patriarchal structures in which, men are the warriors, women are that which is to be protected. Women can be leaders, but they're symbolically important. I think there's always the assumption they will go off and be mums at the end of the day, get married, give it up, and do the right thing. The misogyny that I saw in talking to people in the radical right, I mean, it's part of the reason why I had struggled to interview that many women. I was like, I need to talk to some EDL angels. Well, I can't talk to any EDL angels. Why? Turns out that EDL angels are like pariahs within the group, because when women were trying to do the things that gave men status, drinking, swearing, there's a sort of sexual culture around demonstration in other towns, they would be roundly abused for this in the most kind of classist terms. So really disgusting language used about those women who would, engaged with in casual sexual encounters. And I would say, but is this not really misogynist of you? Is this not... What about the men? They're doing the same thing. Oh, yeah, they're disgusting as well. But it's the women. The real disgust is reserved for those women that transgress these ideas of kind of sexual purity. So that misogyny in these groups it's against Muslim other women, but it's also directed internally towards women in the movements themselves when they go too far improving their masculinity by doing the same things as the men. They become pariahs, this kind of idea of pariah femininity. And I think, Jada Franson is a kind of case in point, actually, since I finished doing the research. Jada Franson, who was the deputy leader of Britain First, had come out and basically she left Britain First and she came out and accused the leader, Paul Golding, of basically sort of domestic violence against her, of abuse, of physical abuse of her. And, there's no love lost there. And I saw that Tommy Robinson had blocked her on Twitter the other day. And she said to me, I couldn't tell you the whole story when we met, when I was involved in Britain First, because of what was going on. But now I can come forward and I can say how much I was being abused within this group. And of course, most people won't have much sympathy for her. But her story is quite interesting in that she was, as somebody who's really popular with the Britain First supporters, and had a lot of influence. She was retweeted by Trump at one point, and that was a kind of like real pinnacle for her, she's kind of said. So her story was one of, abuse and violence within this group, and she's there as a really popular, symbolic Bodicea figure, she's known as. But at the same time, there's this kind of going on behind the scenes. And, she's sort of said more recently, I'm only doing this because there are no good men in our groups. They're all weak. They're awful. Hal Gower, another woman who's influential in the English Defence League, was like, the men, they're thugs in this group. This is not, there's a lot of, tension between the men and the women. You had, again, Tommy Robinson saying, I don't want the women coming out marching because, it's a battlefield out there. And the women were like absolutely incensed in the early days of the EDL. And they said, no, we're going to do it with or without you. Men turn up. They didn't want them. They turn up and march behind them. These are the kinds of tensions that are being faced. It's again, we wouldn't have much sympathy for them, but it's not an easy thing to be a woman in this scene with the pushback that you get from other women and from men, and then obviously sort of the stigma that you would have for being involved in these movements in the first place.
Yeah, and that's fascinating because it does go back to the question of like, are there like sort of parallel societies, and why would you radicalize into these groups, basically, if you don't agree with that sort of vision of the society. But I'd like to maybe again surface another question that's posed by Jibs Olela in the Q&A, which is basically, Evian, you started saying you wrote your book because the previous book was written 20 years ago. And so the question here is basically, what kind of evolution have we seen in the contemporary far right over the 20 years using the gender prism? So how has gender evolved within that period?
Yeah, thanks a lot for that question. And I will say that when I was writing my book, I had noticed a lot of the similar issues that Kathleen Blee had written about in her book 20 years ago. So, I mean, in terms of, I would actually say gender has not actually evolved that much within the far right scene in the last 20 years. Because we see that, sorry, you can see my microphone. Okay, so because we see that, women and men are still expected to have the same roles in terms of, women see their primary roles as the wives and mothers within the movement. So that has remained the same, as well as how men are constructed to be the providers and protectors of women and of children within the movement. And so I described this within the book as pouring old wine into new bottles, because the ideas and the ideology essentially remains the same. Perhaps we might see, things like anti-Islam become more prominent within the far right, for instance, than in the past. But by and large, we see a lot of the same ideas in terms of gender roles, as well as who are constructed to be enemy outsiders for these actors. But I think what is very different today compared to the past, and this is a core argument of my book, is the visibility that women in the far right have now, which was not afforded to them in the past. So when Blee did her book, she was going around the country interviewing different women within these groups who lived in very isolated communities and often played a much more invisible role in terms of the logistics and the organization to support these groups. But what I'm actually showing in my book is actually how public those roles have actually become with the advent of things like social media. And by that, I mean that the far right women that I've studied, they very much exploit the amplification and exposure that is afforded to them on mainstream social media platforms in ways that they can connect with audiences that we might not have seen in the past. So one example is that women in the far right have long published books. And women in the far right today are still doing so, but they're actually trying to solicit feedback from their audiences as they are writing those books and trying to get that sort of crowdsourced suggestions. And so what is different today is that they're actually involving strangers, the public, in their content creation and making that part of the product and eventually into the book publication, right? And so that is quite a different aspect. So throughout my book, I sort of highlight various examples in which far-right women influencers are actively engaging with their audiences in the content creation process in order to make it a much more of a mainstream phenomenon.
Thanks, Evian. We have several questions by Kazi Bismillah, but I think, yeah, I mean, Islam and religion is at the center of several of these questions. Maybe if I want to sort of bring those questions together, maybe towards you, Liz, because you mentioned earlier that you've been also looking at, particularly at reciprocal radicalization, and because you've been looking at gender through these different forms of extremism, what are sort of the key differences that you see or have seen in the role of gender in basically Islamist extremism on the one hand and far-right extremism on the other hand?
Sure. I think I'll start that by saying, you know, I was looking at that concept of cumulative extremism, reciprocal radicalization. I didn't find it when I was doing this work. So, and that was because the radical right actors were they were obsessed with Islam. They were, you know, they mobilized around it. You know, it's kind of the reason, isn't it, why the EDL was founded in the first place? It was Anjem Choudary burning poppies and, you know, disrespecting British servicemen. But when I was talking to those who were involved in Chowdhury's group, you know, they just weren't interested. It just didn't concern them. They didn't, I mean, they would sort of ask me, what's Tommy Robinson like, things like that, but they weren't, as a movement, they weren't concerned. It didn't impact their planning at that point in time. Now, that might be because protests had been quite curtailed during that time. There was a period where there was heading off between the two sets of actors. But when I was doing my research, you know, that Anjem wasn't doing any of his protests, and the radical right were getting into sort of confrontations with far left and the police. You know, that was where that kind of was happening. What were the differences? Well, I think, you know, I didn't really succeed in talking to any women who were very close to Anjem Choudhury. You know, they were extremely protective to the point where I could only speak to people that I found online, right? They weren't going to give me any access. They were worried about children being taken away from families that were where the parents were deemed extreme. So the control that they had over that was different. It was that's the first thing that I would say. In terms of the gender norms, that was also extremely different. I know, Evian, you just said about this being sort of old wine in new bottles, but I don't think, you know, I think there is a difference in when you look at the mobilization, the narratives around which the radical right mobilized in terms of, you know, gay rights. I'm sure some of it was instrumental, but for some actors that I spoke to, I don't think it was. I think they were genuinely concerned. And I think sort of Anne-Marie Waters was a case in point. You know, she is a gay woman and she was mobilizing around gay women's rights and her, you know, claimed fears around how Islam would affect that. So that seems to me quite a sort of, that's quite a new thing in terms of the evolution of gender in aspects of the far right. And of course, it's not one that we would see at all in the Islamists that I was talking to. There's absolutely no tolerance of that because they're guided by Islam and by the Quran and Sunnah. So in terms of other differences in gender was around the kind of, I guess, the relationship with space. I already said that the radical right was extremely mobilized by things that were happening in their local space. And it was almost the opposite for the Islamists. They were much more explicitly ideological and concerned with learning, because it was learning and this idea of, being the key scholar. So Anjem's masculinity was not in his ability to fight. His status in the group was around his knowledge. And when he was put in prison in 2016, people would say to me, we don't have anyone to ask now. Who do we ask? We don't know enough. So it was around knowledge and learning. That was what gave men status. And that was also what gave validity to the violence. Jihad without violence, that's not jihad, that's just violence. That was what people would say to me. Very different from the attitude towards learning in the radical right. There was a reverence for cleverness, by which I kind of mean like mischievous criminal cleverness, kind of having one up on the police or on other protesters, but there was no reverence for learning. And this was a way that people I spoke to who'd failed at school could join Anjem Choudhury's group, and they were learning, and they felt like this was a different set of things they're learning. They're learning about Islam, they're learning Arabic, and it was part of achieving this masculine status for them. So that was very different. There's obviously much more coherence. I was looking at this Choudhury network, much more coherence in what they think, partly by my choice of looking at Choudhury's network, than in the radical right. But they were doing some of the same things, but I would say that there was enough significant differences to make me feel that, gender did not function in the same way. Even within the radical right, gender was functioning in different ways between different groups. So, with Al Muhajirun and the network, again, quite different things were happening at some points.
Thanks, Liz. We have one more question still for you, Evian, from colleague Bibi van Ginkel from ICCT, asking about coded language on social media. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, Evian?
Yes, absolutely. So by coded language, I refer to language with an implication, but does not explicitly state. So that could be, for example, it could be, say, manipulation of text and visuals in order to communicate in-group identity. And this was particularly apparent during the pandemic. So, for example, Instagram had introduced a feature on all posts containing words like COVID, vaccination, etc., in which they would have a pop-up banner that would appear on posts containing these words. Well, these influencers knew about that, so they were trying to find creative ways to circumvent the moderation of their content. And so they were doing things like manipulating characters of text, like using the @ or using numbers in order then to sort of still signify their message and continue to spread essentially disinformation and hate speech about the virus, and still building what is very much became accepted community norms for content creation and posting amongst these influencers. But at other times it could be using shorthand, so using words like Zog, Zionist occupied government, or Globo for globalist, so using these shorthands. But then at other times, it's a lot more of an insidious process of using coded language. So one example that I bring up within the book is often how these women are drawing upon other online communities to further their propaganda efforts. So, for example, they'll use terms like glow up, which comes from the beauty blogging community to signify a period of personal transformation inside and out to achieve your best self or your most natural self. And sometimes this can take a period of years. So this is a term that originated from the beauty blogging community, but these influencers were using that term to signify their own radicalization journey. So there was an innuendo in terms of how they were actually using this type of coded language as euphemisms or as metaphors to get their messaging across. And I think this is actually a really important aspect, particularly then when we turn to issues like countering the far right online. And this is something that I've been in conversation with tech companies about, because these women are very adept at their posting behaviors, so that way they can circumvent the flagging of their content, or that way they are not seen to actually violate community guidelines on platforms compared to, say, their male counterparts who are usually much more explicit in their rhetoric and in their posting behavior. And so these women very much will skirt the edge and find creative ways to get their extreme views across, but do so in such ways that are very subtle, and I would actually argue a lot more insidious in their activities.
Thanks, Vivian. Liz, you referred earlier to the calls for gay rights in some of these communities, and we have a question from Leo Thorncroft, whether you think that we will see more appeals to the trans community and trans individuals into the extreme right, given their very traditional defensive positions with regard to binary sexuality.
I mean, trans rights has been a mobilizing point for anti-trans rights has been a mobilizing point for the radical right, because men's bodies are so associated with particular forms of masculinity, and they are regarded as intransmutable. There is no changing what you are, and in a sense, there was some similarity with the Islamists. It's like the radical right they were very sort of, they would talk about, nature and, the way that we are intended to be as men and women. And the Islamists would talk about God and the way that God intends us to be as men and women. So I would be surprised, but, given that there is constant evolution, I would be interested in the gymnastics that were involved in kind of creating mobilizing around that idea. But that things do change, things do evolve all the time. I'm sure Evian's got something to say on anti-trans campaigning as well as part of the alt-right on this.
I think you're absolutely right, Liz, in terms of anti-trans mobilization being and sometimes a cross-cutting issue across different groups. But one thing I did reflect upon in your comments, Liz, also about things like LGBTQ rights with the far right, and in terms of its evolution and perhaps adoption of these stances. The first is, and perhaps you might disagree, but often when we do see that come into play, it's never necessarily to defend LGBTQ rights, more so that it is anti-Islam in its orientation. And perhaps we can debate whether or not to the effects that is true. But the second point is that I think it can also very much depend where contextually the far right is situated as it comes to themes like LGBTQ rights, because I certainly see that much more within Europe and within the UK, but at least within the North American far right, there is not yet a wider acceptance of LGBTQ rights amongst far right actors within the US and with Canada. It's still a lot more conservative when it comes to their understandings of gender roles and norms. Even amongst the perhaps, let's say, more educated, more middle-class actors that I looked at, there was still a very strong stance against LGBTQ rights and this lack of acceptance for them. So I think it just can kind of also depend on the context in which you're looking at when it comes to these ideological variations amongst far-right actors.
Liz,
do you want to respond to that, or?
Well, I would say that, the actors that I was talking to, and obviously in the scene, they are, they're primarily concerned with Islam, and they see the evils of Islam everywhere. And, when you go to lots of, you start seeing the things that they're seeing too. You don't look at Twitter the same. You're seeing the things that, you're noticing the things that they would notice, because they're seeing these things absolutely everywhere and enabled by all sorts of people that you'd never think of, So I think it didn't really surprise me that, in defending LGB rights, it was always about kind of contrasting with Islam or being anti-Islam, because that was what they were obsessed with, almost, some of them to obsess with. It was, ruining their lives, ruining relationships. But that's not, and clearly it is strategic and instrumentalizing these rights for some people and for some groups, I've no doubt. But I think it would be wrong to say that absolutely every single actor was kind of ingenuine that they were disingenuous about their mobilization around that issue. And just to sort of the other point, I guess, is that, you know, you'd see people at these demonstrations that you wouldn't expect to see. So it's not unthinkable to me, people whose interests you do not think it is to be part of these movements. So I would see people of color at demonstrations, and I'd sort of go and stand near them and think, oh, I'll try and talk to them. And I never succeeded in talking to them. And I think, why are you here? What's in it for you to be here? But like, they were there and they were, you know, clapping along at all the things. And, you know, I'd see the same people, you know, a few times. I'd sort of sometimes think, is that a journalist, you know, who's kind of but no, I think there were, you know, and again, with the women, Thomas, you said, you know, what would, if you don't agree with the vision, why would you join? And I think people think that about, why would women join these groups? But lots of women enjoy with it. They believe in a lot of what there is there. And, you know, if you're a woman, you're used to being part of institutions which push back at you in various ways. So perhaps these movements don't feel like that much of a difference from being paid less at work, or, you know, being objectified on the street, or, you know, the various ways in which misogyny is evident in all of women's lives. And they agree with that. They agree with these binary gender roles. They want women to not have to work. They don't think feminism's been good for women, a lot of these people. So they agree with a lot of it, but not all of it. And they'll put up with those things that, you know, don't serve them, that you know, perhaps inexplicably to us, but they get something from it. So perhaps, you know, people don't always act in their own best interests.
Yeah, no, and interesting, and of course also reminds me from my own research also on the whole motivations of women joining joining the caliphate in Syria, basically joining a very patriarchal, very traditional society, and sometimes some of these women doing that as a sort of a cry for freedom, which is completely counterintuitive and hard to understand. And at the same time, I think if you really make the effort, you can see why some would see that way. Maybe I want to move to a next, perhaps last segment of our conversation, with two more questions, but I'll take them in sequence. The first question I have for both of you is, do you think that, I mean, you started particularly, Evian, saying, well, you wrote this book because there wasn't any book like this for 20 years. So it does feel like it's a topic that has been widely neglected. But do you think that not only academics, but also policymakers and practitioners in the field of countering terrorism and extremism are underestimating this phenomenon and this challenge? And why is it that we are underestimating or neglecting this particular aspect of this issue?
Yeah, that's a very big question. No, but I mean, I think you are correct in identifying that even, especially within policy spaces, there has been this blind spot when it comes to the role of women within the far right. And there is, at the same time, this recent push to include more studies of masculinity when it comes towards situating its role within the far right. And I very much believe that we should be focusing on that. At the same time, also focusing on the role of femininity within the far right. But I think when it comes to specific areas that policymakers should incorporate when it comes towards then situating gender, perhaps in things like PCVE programming or interventions, is first understanding that women and men are radicalized and recruited by both women and men in equal ways. So as I mentioned earlier, the fact that these influencers I studied described being inspired by male activists, and then that sort of jump-started their own activism in this space, and not assuming that women are radicalizing women and men are radicalizing men, but that it's an interchangeable process. Related to that, I do think that those working in the policy space should also understand the various ways in which gender informs radicalization beliefs and then the acceptance of gender norms. So in the book, I really focus on the role of motherhood for far-right women in terms of how it is seen to be empowering and to provide agency for these women, in ways that tap into personal grievances and the sense of purpose and of fulfillment. And I think, Liz, you would broadly agree with this, is for policy makers, understanding that activism for women and for men looks different based on their prescribed gender roles, and that violence isn't the benchmark for extremist views, like especially when men are expected and are brought within a culture to act violently because it suits their hypermasculinity. But meanwhile, women are not taken as seriously for their roles unless they engage in violent behavior, unless we actually see them as offenders in cases. Otherwise, they are seen to be quite invisible when it comes to their involvement within the space. And then the same thing kind of works when it comes towards disengagement and exiting for women and men, and that looks different as well. So as Kathleen Lee had written 20 years ago, and I think as she's written since, in the literature, we see that for many women within far-right groups and organizations, they had very real concerns for their safety and for their children's safety that prevented them from leaving these groups and these organizations, as well as the type of lack of social support networks because of the social isolation that they were in for several years. But this is quite different from maybe, let's say, the far-right women influencers that I studied, because as I write in the book, sometimes they leave, then they'll return back to the scene, then they'll leave again, and then they might return back to the scene. Because for these far-right women, it's oftentimes about the fame and the celebrity that they receive as spokespersons for the movement, and they very much crave that attention that they receive from audiences. And then perhaps my final points before I let Liz take the reins on this. In terms of things like content moderation on social media platforms, I very much believe that there are gender blind spots in terms of what are the standards of violation for community guidelines. Because for many social media platforms, the threshold is about violence or incitement to violence. And we see that far and above, men within the far right tend to get banned from these platforms because they directly incite violence. But these far right women often rarely face any consequences for their posting activity because they tend to skirt the edge of what is considered to be acceptable or tolerable content because they don't directly violate community guidelines. And so because of this, they're able to persist and just gain larger audiences over time. And that does have very real consequences when it comes then to the growth and the mainstreaming of extreme ideas for broad audiences. So I will leave it to that. And Liz, you have worked extensively as well within this policy space. So I'd be curious to hear your response.
Sure. And I think, women are always underestimated, but in thinking about violent extremism, this emphasis on violence, it's not wrong. It depends how many resources you have, where you want to put your resources, which you consider to be most important. And, that has been a decision that's been made often in the past to focus on the actual violence. And that has tended to be men. But these are whole systems and they have whole projects. They include men and women. And it would be a mistake to ignore the role of women, even if they are not violent, in supporting those systems and in supporting those projects. And I think, particularly in a Western context where we've had a focus on violence, perhaps for Islamist extremists, but in the far right groups in a Western context share many of the same structures and values as the states themselves. They share ideas about what whiteness means, what power means, what gender relations look like. So the types of threat that they pose to society are more insidious. They are a lot more about a democratic threat, I think, to society. And, I didn't look at online, but when I was talking to people, the amount of power and legitimacy that they felt from being online as men and women was pretty intoxicating, because it was the first time for many of them they'd felt this in their lives. And I think we have, with such an accumulation of power in particular spaces, in and such the reach that gives people, we have a very different kind of a problem. So it would be a mistake with the far right for Western governments to focus on violence, because it's not violence that is maybe the biggest threat that the far right poses. It is the undermining of democratic principles. Democracies are not, so we've seen in the Netherlands, that they're vulnerable to this rhetoric, and this is not just about what men are saying; it's about what women and men are saying about this situation together. So for me, that is really, really important. And of course, you've just got to have. It's not just about seeing the women; it's about having women involved in the security apparatus that's set up to deal with this. If you look at something like I'm talking about Islamists now, but if there were only like 2 women channel providers, the prevention, hands-on prevention arm dealing with mostly Islamists to start with, not at all equipped to deal with women going off to trying to travel to Syria and Iraq when Islamic State was calling for that. You need to have women involved, in thinking about these things and in being involved in the delivery structures and prevention structures practically in order to engage with the women that haven't been seen before. And of course, to think about the ways in which gender is impacting on men and differentially across these different parts of the far right, because they don't all look the same.
Thanks. And actually, you already sort of addressed my question and the question that I meant to ask you afterwards all together, but that's fine. That's because you read in my mind. But then maybe as a very last question, I'd like to ask both of you, how do you see basically the future role of women and gender in far right? How do you see this topic evolving in the coming years? Maybe you first, Evian.
So yes, I can speak to the future for women in the far right, perhaps less so for men, and I think Liz is well posed to answer that better than I am. So I started to see this shift towards the end of writing this book, and it's become much more prevalent now, is that I am seeing Gen Z and younger millennial women who are taking up issues like anti-feminism further. I mean, when I started writing this book, discussions about anti-feminism, they were still rather fringe on YouTube, and now they've become arguably much more of a mainstream talking point. Now, besides the evolution of concepts like anti-feminism, I am seeing younger Gen Z and young millennial women take up issues like that. And I think in some ways kind of learning from their predecessor about certain strategies and tactics for audience engagement, and also what gains traction and visibility, particularly when it comes to online conversations. And so I'm seeing less of a focus on ideology per se, or political commentary, you could even argue, and more a focus on creating things like lifestyle content that has certain implications in terms of it has certain ideological implications about gender, race, and class expectations. But this type of lifestyle content that is much more subtle and in some ways a bit more insidious compared to the type of overt ideological activism that we saw in the 2010s, for example. And so I think that is where the trend is going. And in some ways that is kind of worrying, because even for myself, sometimes when I look at this content, it's not immediately flagged to me that it does have potential for radicalization until there are perhaps certain keywords, certain coded language that is employed. And that's when I realized, oh yes, like that this is actually, problematic content, but it's very much presented in this aesthetic and in this framing that doesn't pose any red flags.
Thanks, Evian. Liz, where do you see the future of gender and extremism?
Well, it's not very easy to be optimistic, I think, in the current context. I mean, I don't have a crystal ball, but I mean, obviously, the current conflict is incredibly polarizing, so that has given so much energy to anti-Islam extremists to anti-Semitic extremists. It's absolutely it's energized that whole it's energized polarization and extremism in the UK and also in other countries in Europe. I mean, there's more space. I think it's clear from Evian's book there's overlaps between celebrity culture, influencer culture, and the far right, and that provides space for women to be involved. Ultimately, unless the ideological kind of program of these groups change dramatically, they're always going to experience pushback, because it's that misogyny that's inherent in this kind of project of men going forward and protecting the women that will always keep pushing them back. They can be figureheads. I mean, like, I'm thinking of Marine Le Pen, I'm thinking of Jada Franson, I'm thinking of Anne-Marie Waters, but I wonder where that takes them. I think, the biggest threat is around electoral threats in countries where that is possible through their electoral systems, and in the unifying of different kind of factions in the far right, which enables greater them to forget divisions, and it just enables a sort of bigger groundswell for both women and for men. But I mean, you look at the Tommy, be brief, you look at Tommy Robinson's call, that protest at the Cenotaph in London the other weekend, when we have Remembrance Sunday and we think about veterans. His call out on social media was to English men and football lads, and that is predominantly who was there. And that is fairly consistent. So it would take us on a shift in the ideology. But, I'm not optimistic about the situation for any of us at the moment, to be honest.
Thanks, Liz. And because we're nearing the end of our event, maybe the very, very last question is a bit more personal, just for both of you. But Evian, what is next for you? What is your next project after successfully launching this book, obviously? What is the next thing for you?
So I'm currently working on an EU-funded project looking at platforms' content moderation policies on the far right, because there is not a very clear and systemic approach to that. And so I have been interviewing tech company employees who design these policies, as well as other various stakeholders, ranging from government to think tanks and civil society, that are also part of that consultation process. So that's what I'm currently working on at the moment.
Super interesting. Thanks, Evian. And what about you, Liz?
Well, I think, I'd like to see the book in my hands, an actual physical copy, rather than constantly correcting all my many mistakes in the versions of it that keep coming to me. But I think that this is a good I hope that this is a good moment in terms of academic research, in that gender is being taken more seriously and by more people, including men, which I hate to have to say, but it's really when men start taking things seriously in the field that they are taken seriously. And obviously masculinities gives an into that. And it means something to people. You talk to people about gender on the street, maybe they're not quite sure what you mean. You talk to them about masculinity, I think they get a sense of what you're interested in. So I think there's more work to be done on that, and around sort of shared norms around violence and gender norms and the power in those gender relations. That's what I'm interested in. Before I go off and do something nice, like set up a dog rescue centre or something, which would probably have more tangible, positive outcomes. But yes, that's what I'm thinking of next.
Thanks a lot, Liz. Thanks a lot, Evian. I think that brings us to an end to our conversation. I would like to remind the book by Dr. Evian Leidig, which is The Woman of the Far Right, Social Media Influencers and Online Radicalization at Columbia University Press, and the book by Dr. Elizabeth Pearson, which is Extreme Britain, Gender, Masculinity and Radicalization, with Hearst and Oxford University Press, both of them available online and in the best bookstores. Thanks a lot, Evian. Thanks a lot, Elizabeth. Thanks a lot to everyone in the audience also for your questions. Please fill the survey as it pops up when you close this session. Very much appreciated. And I wish you all a very lovely evening and rest of the day.